Hi, my name is Dave Lambert with Fort Wayne Peace Action. Today we have the honor of having Fran Quigley with us. Fran is a clinical professor of law at Indiana University School of Law in Indianapolis and senior advisor to the IU Center for Global Health. He's a journalist who contributes to a variety of publications. He is the author of Walking Together, Walking Far, How a U.S. and African Medical School Partnership is Winning the Fight Against HIV and AIDS. He is former director of the ACLU of Indiana. Most recently, he has investigated and done extensive research on our country's use of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, in waging wars abroad. Most specifically, the fact that our own Hoosier State is home to multiple sites of manufacturing, testing, and support of drones and drone technology. Purdue University is involved, as are several Indiana companies. Fran's three-part series on Indiana connections to drone warfare was published in Indianapolis Nouveau and the Bloomington Alternative, and recently won a Society of Professional Journalists First Place Award for investigative reporting. We hope you'll use this video and share it with others to blow the whistle and sound the alarm to the deadliness of drones so that we can put an end to this terrible instrument of war. It's my pleasure to welcome Fran to Fort Wayne. Fran?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you to the Fort Wayne Peace Action Coalition for hosting me today. I would like to start off the discussion of drone warfare with a couple of stories. And the stories illustrate, I think, the best and worst case scenarios of drone warfare. And I think it's important to understand why drone warfare has been so popular and is so growing. And knowing the best case scenario helps with that. The best case scenario for drone attacks and drone warfare, I think, would be properly characterized as the use of drone warfare against a man named Baitullah Mehsud. And Baitullah Mehsud was the Pakistani Taliban. Baitullah Mehsud was widely understood to be a bad guy, to be honest with you. He was considered to be responsible for a cadre of suicide bombers who had killed Pakistani military, who had killed Pakistani police, who had killed Pakistani civilians. And when on August 5th, 2009, a United States Predator drone, an unmanned aerial vehicle, basically a flying robot, hovering over an area of tribal Pakistan, fired 2 Hellfire missiles into a home and killed Baitullah Mehsud. Well, that was considered to be pretty much the best case scenario for drone warfare, because Baitullah Mehsud, a pretty bad guy, was killed, no longer around to conduct violence, no longer around to design and encourage violence, especially against innocent civilians. And no U.S. officials and no U.S. troops were put in harm's way. That drone was operated, it was a robot, remember, there was no human being in that unmanned aerial vehicle, hence the name. It was operated by folks working out of a darkened room in Langley, Virginia, in CIA headquarters. And they were far out of harm's way. No U.S. official, no U.S. kid, no U.S. Army, Marine, Navy, Air Force, etc. was put in harm's way in the process of actually killing Baitullah Mehsud. So that's what's considered to be, and often propounded by the Obama administration and other supporters of drone warfare, is kind of the best case scenario. You can see why. You can see the attraction of drone warfare. This was less expensive in life and in treasure than sending a group of actual live military soldiers to conduct that business. Now, the worst case scenario, I think, can be illustrated by a story that is told by our friend and colleague Kathy Kelly of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, based out of Chicago. And Kathy has made several trips to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And at one time, she went to a village called Miranshah. And in Miranshah, she talked to folks who had been the eyewitness to a drone attack there. And the drone attack there, like the drone attack that killed Batullah Masood, was a U.S. Predator drone operated by U.S. officials thousands of miles away, sending Hellfire missiles into a living arrangement, a home in Pakistan. But in this case, instead of killing the head of the Pakistani Taliban, that particular drone attack killed 3 people, none of whom were Taliban, none of whom were Al-Qaeda, none of whom were enemies of the United States. 2 men and a 7-year-old boy. And the folks who Kathy Kelly talked to, who were eyewitnesses to the aftermath of this attack, said they came upon the scene, which was completely blown out and charred, and the human beings that had been killed were unrecognizable. They were burnt beyond recognition. They ended up having to be identified later only by their hands and their feet. And the bodies were even still on fire. It was just a gruesome, gruesome sight. But several folks in the village came rushing to see what they could do to help, which turned out to be a very bad idea because those Good Samaritans themselves were the subject of a second U.S. attack, and it killed 6 more folks, some of them who were killed as a result of the impact of the missiles landing, throwing them against walls, throwing them against stone, and they died of significant injuries and brain injuries as a result. So that scenario, the people killed in the village in Miranshah, the house in Miranshah, I think that can easily be characterized as maybe the worst case scenario for drone warfare, right? What I'd like to point out tonight is that drone warfare in the best case scenario and drone warfare in the worst case scenario are really one and the same. The more we learn, the more we realize that innocent folks are being killed by drone attacks. When you look at the situation with Batullah Masood, the U.S., quote-unquote, got their man, right? But the U.S. got their man only with an attack that killed several other folks, all of whom were civilians. Batullah Masood's family, his physician, and folks that happened to be in the area at the time. And in fact, the United States had killed dozens of other folks in previous drone attacks trying to get to Batullah Masood. So the people who were killed in the house in Miranshah were just like people who were killed in the process of trying to kill Batullah Masood with drone warfare. What I'm going to try to present to you today is that both types of scenarios are illegal, both types of scenarios are immoral, and both types of scenarios for drone warfare are self-defeating. So I'd like to talk today about the facts of drone warfare and I'd like to give you an argument about drone warfare. The facts are, number one, that drone warfare is pervasive and drone warfare is revolutionary. I may not be the first person for you to hear say this, but I'm not going to be the last, I guarantee you that. And that is that drone warfare is the trend in the United States military development right now. There is impossible to have a conversation about modern warfare without talking about the issue of robotic warfare, about sending machines to do the type of jobs, the type of military warfare jobs that we used to have human beings do. The second fact that we'll talk about is that drone warfare is faceless and drone warfare is reckless. Drone warfare, as we see, is a robot. And as we see, and we heard a little bit with the house in Miranshah, and I'll give you some numbers and some broader perspective to back that up, is it's reckless and kills a lot of individuals who were never intended to be victims of that warfare. And the third fact I'd like to present is that drone warfare is happening in our own backyard, right here in Indiana. We have a significant involvement in our state in this significant trend in modern warfare. And then I'd like to make an argument. And the argument is 3 parts. Number one, that drone warfare is illegal. When we are conducting missile attacks from robot airplanes, we are violating U.S. law and we're violating international law, and we're thumbing our nose at all of the treaties and all of the agreements that we've made both domestically and internationally in this regard. And the second argument I'd like to make is that drone warfare is self-defeating. It may seem, and you can see the attraction when you look at something like the story of Batula Massoud, the attraction of drone warfare. Hey, this is no U.S. Soldiers are put at risk. This is actually probably fiscally a little less costly than sending staffed manned bombers or certainly a manned ground attack to take out enemies or perceived enemies of the United States. So in the short term, it seems like, well, this is good for the U.S. But I'm going to argue, and you're going to hear from other folks who have looked at this very closely, that this is actually in the long term very harmful and very self-defeating to the United States interests, even if we look at it through the very narrow prism of what's good for us in the United States. And finally, I'd like to argue that this is an un-American and immoral way of conducting warfare. This is a secretive tactic. It's an undemocratic tactic. It is one that's destructive of civilian life, and it's one that we should be embarrassed by. So let's talk first about the fact that drone warfare is pervasive. The Obama administration CIA Director Leon Panetta, as of this taping, is actually on his way out of the position. But he has said of drone attacks, quote, "Very frankly, it's the only game in town in terms of confronting and disrupting al-Qaeda leadership." And the numbers bear that out. The Obama administration has used drone strikes 4 times as often as the Bush administration ever did. The 2010 United States budget included $4.5 billion in money devoted to drone manufacture and training of individuals to conduct drone warfare. And that number is double what it was just a few years ago, and that number is expected to continue to grow. We have about 7,000 drones in our arsenal in the United States now, and we're on our way. We're on the trajectory to have more drones in our arsenal than we have actual manned airplanes. And we're on our way to having more folks trained to conduct these drones from remote settings, you know, the joystick like we're used to from video games, and looking at a computer screen rather than actually being in the plane. We're on our way to training more folks to do that work than we are to training folks to be pilots of actual live airplanes. These drone strikes have been occurring during the Obama administration on an average of about 4 strikes a week in Pakistan alone. There also have been launched in Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq and other locations. And they are carried out by secret target lists. The CIA and the United States military both have secret target lists of who they're trying to get, who they're trying to kill with these drone strikes from the air, from the robot airplanes. And that information is kept completely hidden from the United States people. It's kept completely hidden from the international community despite multiple attempts for Freedom of Information Act requests domestically by the ACLU and internationally by the United Nations, asking the United States to disclose how are you choosing who you're going to target. And unfortunately, some of the published reports about drone attacks and who's being chosen suggest that it's not always even folks that we believe to be dangerous to the United States or Taliban or al-Qaeda leadership. Sometimes they appear to be folks who are put on the list at the request of the countries that are allowing us to fly drones in their airspace. Jane Mayer of The New Yorker wrote a terrific piece on drone warfare. And if you have to read just one article about drone warfare, I would suggest that one, just because it actually gives a nice narrative viewpoint of what's going on here and how this has significantly changed warfare at this stage in history in 2011. But Jane Mayer reported that folks on that list are not just Taliban or al-Qaeda, but sometimes they're just enemies of, for instance, the government of Pakistan, which has allowed the United States to fly drones in their airspace. So we're actually carrying out hits, if you will, on behalf of the host governments. Second fact, drone warfare is reckless. When you think about bombing of any kind, and this is bombing, when you think about bombing, bombing is clean and bombing is precise when you look at it from the perspective of a military planner, when you look at it from a war room in Washington, but on the ground it's very messy. On the ground it's enormously messy. And a couple of times during this presentation I like to quote some folks, and usually I'll be quoting folks who are not opposed to the United States military response after September 11th. These are folks who believe that the United States should be involved in war after September 11th. but they have problems with this particular form of warfare, drone warfare. And I think it's important to note that even some of these folks that are simply hawks on these issues don't think this is the right way to conduct this type of business. Jeffrey Adicott, who is a law professor at St. Mary's and who served as a senior legal advisor to the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, has said, quote, "For every one bad guy you kill," meaning with drone warfare, "you can expect 1.5 civilian deaths. Because no matter how good the technology," his quote is, and you'll see this in my PowerPoint, "killing from that high above, there's always the oops factor." And unfortunately, let me say, I apologize. If you'd like to avert your eyes for a minute, that's fine. There are going to be some disturbing photos here because, unfortunately, drone warfare, sending Hellfire missiles into the countryside of Pakistan or Yemen or where have you, leads to some very gruesome results. So the estimate has been by various observers that maybe 1 out of every 5 casualties of drone warfare are non-combatants. And let me say this about the numbers. The numbers are estimates, and they have to be estimates because, as I mentioned, the United States is not disclosing fully the information of how many drone attacks are being conducted and what the impact of those attacks have been. A couple of organizations have done terrific work on this, and I commend you looking at their websites if you're interested in learning more. One is New America Foundation. New America Foundation has done research to find that there, mostly from Pakistani reports, that there have been several hundred strikes a year since Obama took office. And an organization called CIVIC, C-I-V-I-C, which stands for Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict, again, echoes the New America Foundation of estimate of a couple of thousand folks have been killed. And what CIVIC did was a very useful, technique, is that they looked at some of the reports that start off as saying the United States launched a drone attack and 14 militants were killed. That's the report we get back in the United States. And usually that comes from Pakistani reports, not from the United States, because that's not being disclosed fully by the United States military or the CIA, certainly. So you see that kind of report that this many militants are killed, right? And Glenn Greenwald, the blogger, actually wrote a nice piece recently about, he looked at a New York Times report from April 22nd of this year, and it talked about U.S. drones killing 23 militants in Pakistan. And he wrote about the first thing he thought is, well, how do you know that they're militants, right? And he looked, and even in the actual story itself, the actual article itself, which talked about 23 militants being killed, further down in that very story, without the kind of investigation that CIVIC conducted to see who actually was killed, it said that the people killed included 5 children and 4 women. So these quote-unquote militants, 23 militants, included at least 9 people who we know could not have been militants. And what CIVIC did is looked at several of these types of reports over the years and then went back into the Pakistani countryside, interviewed eyewitnesses and families and folks connected to it to actually break down how many of the folks being killed are civilians. So the estimate is that at least 1 in 5 folks being killed by drone attacks are civilians. But it may be much worse than that. David Kilcullen wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and Kilcullen was an advisor for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and an advisor, special advisor for General David Petraeus as well. And he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in 2009, which was widely quoted and frankly should be, entitled "Death from Above, Outrage Below," where he repeated Pakistani estimates that maybe as many as 50 civilians were killed for every militant that is actually killed by a drone attack. So that's what we're looking at. We got drone warfare that is pervasive, drone warfare that's reckless, and drone warfare here for us in the state of Indiana is actually happening in our own backyard. I have a graphic here you see on the PowerPoint, and there's little missiles in different locations, which is my estimation of where these physically are in the state of Indiana. And this is a result of several months of Freedom of Information Act requests and Indiana Public Records Act requests to various institutions around the state. And I got to tell you right now, I don't think that I have the full picture, but the picture I was able to obtain is that there's a significant amount of drone activity here in the state of Indiana. First example, Light Machines. Light Machines is a West Lafayette company. And I think Light Machines is an interesting example of what effect the military-industrial complex has on our economy. And of course, President Eisenhower warned us of that many years ago. But Light Machines started out, the owners started out as manufacturers of video games. and they created a video game, and then they created what was essentially hobby remote control helicopters. Interesting stuff, right? But apparently the money in remote control helicopters is far, far removed from the kind of money you can make as a military contractor. And remote control helicopters are actually not that far removed technologically from something called mini drones. Mini drones, which are small drones that are remote controlled, that can go in and out of doors, up and down stairs, can travel hundreds of miles without a human being being very near it at all, controlling the whole situation by remote control, while that drone collects video, while that drone collects audio, and as we'll see, while that drone can actually be weaponized to kill and maim it as well. So Light Machines has produced something called the Voyeur, V-O-Y-E-U-R. And the Voyeur is something about 2.5 feet long. It can hover over and touch the target. It's got various rotors, rotating blades that allow it to fly through the air for dozens, if not hundreds of miles. And you can actually see, if you're interested, to Google YouTube and do Voyeur and Light Machines, and you can see an actual demonstration of this mini drone in action. But Light Machines has also talked about the fact that they're developing the Voyeur to be even smaller, something like a flying hockey puck, even 6 inches, and maybe even a version that's 12 foot long. And Light Machines is doing this with a $10.5 million contract for the United States Navy. A Lafayette Journal and Courier report from 2008 talked about the fact that the Voyeur is a potential, essentially, flying grenade. And that the folks who run Light Machines said, they started off working on this technology as surveillance technology, and they were mandated by the United States government, as anyone manufacturing drones now is to weaponize it. And they actually have to make these even mini drones capable of shooting and killing and exploding. And as we'll see, Light Machines has actually marketed their Voyeur for domestic law enforcement purposes as well. So that's Light Machines in the West Lafayette area. Purdue has a relationship with Light Machines, and Purdue has its own relationship with drone warfare. Purdue's research park is actually the landlord, the home for Light Machines, where they do their work. And actually, Purdue's Burke Nanotechnology Center has a subcontract from Light Machines' Navy contract, where they make antennas for the Voyeur. And Purdue has its own $500,000 contract with the United States Air Force Academy for the university's Robot Vision Lab to help network visual data collected by multiple drones. So that's the West Lafayette area. You'll also see in my little map there a missile in the Terre Haute area. Terre Haute-based Indiana Air National Guard 181st Intelligence Wing is located in that part of the state. And that's also an interesting example. It's an interesting example of how the United States military is changing in this area of this era of robotic warfare. And so the Terre Haute Indiana Air National Guard 181st Intelligence Wing used to have actual planes going in and out of there and fly actual planes, and pilots would train there. No longer. There's no planes there anymore. What that base does now is analyze video data collected by drones flying over Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, etc. And they analyze that video data. Now, they would not disclose to me in my requests for interviews and in the documents I was able to receive what they're actually analyzing the data for, but other reports have suggested, and I think common sense would also tell us that makes sense, is that part of the reason they're analyzing that video data is to select the targets for future drone attacks. That's happening in Terre Haute. In Indianapolis, in my hometown, we've got several instances. We've got the Indianapolis plant of Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce is one of the largest U.S. military contractors. And in the Indianapolis plant of Rolls-Royce, they manufacture the engine for the Global Hawk, which is the largest drone, a huge, huge airplane that's operated remotely. And in southwest Indiana, the Indiana Crane Naval Surface Warfare Center has received millions of dollars in military contracts to expand the combat capability of drones. And back in Indianapolis, there's a company called Enerdell. Again, a kind of interesting example of the military-industrial complex and its effect here in the 21st century. And Enerdell is actually a company that largely makes batteries, and we usually associate the company's work making batteries for cars, which I think most folks think is a great idea and an environmentally sound development. But it turns out Enerdale also has a couple of multi-million-dollar contracts with the U.S. Navy to develop batteries for mini drones, the kind of things that are being manufactured up in West Lafayette so they can fly farther and have more maneuverability and be more reliable in conducting surveillance, but also, unfortunately, be more reliable in conducting actual violent acts in and out of war zones. So that's the situation factually. We know that drone warfare is pervasive. We know that drone warfare is reckless. And we know that drone warfare is happening in our own backyard. So let me present an argument to you. And the argument is this. Number one, drone warfare is illegal. Let's circle back to that best case scenario of Bathullah Massoud if we can for a moment. Bathullah Massoud was killed not by the United States military, but Bathullah Massoud was killed by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Bathullah Massoud was killed not in a war zone, but in a country, Pakistan, where we are not at war. Bathullah Massoud was killed not in the act of committing violence or in a war act, but in fact in a civilian status where he was receiving medical care. And when Bathullah Massoud was killed, and certainly before Bathullah Massoud was killed when the United States tried to get him, many, many civilians were killed, thus violating the rule of distinction, trying to make sure that we do everything we can do to prevent civilian deaths, even in a state of war. So legally, what are drone strikes? Well, legally, they're assassinations. It's very clear they're assassinations. And the law is equally clear that assassinations are just simply not allowed. As you'll see in my PowerPoint, I actually have pictures of two United States presidents. One is Abraham Lincoln, because back in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said very clearly that the assassinations are immoral and illegal, and we don't do them in the United States. And you don't see a lot of peace advocates with a picture of Ronald Reagan in their PowerPoint, but Ronald Reagan has been one of a string of presidents dating back to Gerald Ford who have continued Executive Order 12333, which states the United States will not engage in assassinations. And in fact, before September 11th, we in the United States routinely scolded other countries for being involved in assassinations. But this is what we're doing with drone warfare. And of course, the Geneva Conventions dating back to 1864, the United Nations Charter now saying that we can only act in self-defense, Geneva Conventions of 1949, for U.S. citizens, a due process clause. I can go on and on and on and bore you like a law professor and tell you all the reasons assassinations are illegal, but trust me, assassinations are quite illegal, yet we continue to do that. So getting away from the legal question for a second, and looking, frankly, just at our own self-interest here in the United States of America, there's something we have to think about. When we violate the law to conduct drone warfare, we are taking advantage of a technology that is right now almost uniquely available to the United States, certainly uniquely developed to the level that we have, so that we can violate the law and get away with it and kill people in Pakistan and Yemen and other places where we're not at war, where we certainly haven't arrested people, charged them with crimes, found out with a trier of fact whether they actually committed crimes, which terrorism is usually considered to be in international law. But no, we kill them. So if we do that, what happens when drone technology becomes more available? Which it is. When drones technology is being developed by 40-plus countries right now, including China, including Iran. What happens when a country like that, or even the Taliban, decides that they would like to send a drone over into the United States to hover over the White House and fire their own version of Hellfire missiles in the Oval Office because they think that we, the United States people, are committing crimes against them? How do we tell them that's not legal? Harvard law professor Stephen Carter's written very persuasively on this very topic, saying that when we get to the point, and UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, Philip Alston, has said the same thing, is that we're on the verge of a chaotic world here if we're just going to take advantage of our own technology and our own advancements and our own wealth and power to kill who we want to kill, regardless of what international law says. And then what's going to happen when the tables get turned on us? So that leads to the second point, that the case against drones is that they're not only illegal, but they're also self-defeating. David Kilcullen, again, the former special advisor of the State Department and General Petraeus, talked about the fact that these robot-launched missiles are leading to a groundswell of anger against the United States. David Rode is a New York Times reporter who was held captive by the Taliban in Pakistan in 2009 for many months. And he talked about the fact that to his captors, the United States drone attacks were proof that we were a nation that was going to violate the law and do so in a cowardly way in the eyes of the Taliban and the people of Pakistan. And there's been a huge amount of resistance in Pakistan to that. And of course, the cycle of violence is perpetuated every time we do a drone attack, right? And the Batullah Masood case illustrates that as well. Before we actually killed Batullah Masood, we, the United States, actually killed Batullah Masood. We killed a lot of civilians in the process. After Batullah Masood was killed, it's easy to wash your hands and say mission accomplished, right? Well, some of you may recall that on December 31st of that year, on New Year's Eve of that year, an agent, an Afghan that the CIA thought was a reliable agent, came onto their base for a meeting and then blew himself up and killed several different CIA agents in the process. And he left behind a video saying why he did that. And why did he do it? He did that to avenge the death of Batullah Masood. And how did the United States respond to that suicide bombing? We launched more drone attacks. So the cycle continues and continues in a self-defeating way. Also, we have to think about the domestic use here. The domestic use situation is that we have drone attacks that are just being launched in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, etc. now. But this is soon enough going to be an issue for the human rights of people right here in the United States as well. Because I mentioned that with light machines and Voyeur, but a lot of manufacturers of those so-called mini drones, and there's now one called the Hummingbird. The Hummingbird actually looks physically like a hummingbird, a little thing flying around, and it can take video and audio. And it's being marketed and actually being used in many locations for domestic law enforcement use for surveillance. So our own civil liberties and privacy are at issue here as well. But that's just talking about surveillance. Because if you think about it, that's how drones started being used militarily as well. And it's a slippery slope from using drones just for surveillance to getting to the point where they're actually used to attack. And Notre Dame law professor Mary Ellen O'Connell makes that point very eloquently. She actually is one of the world's leading experts on the legal issues regarding drone warfare. And finally, the case against drones is that they're un-American. And as Dave was kind enough to mention in his introduction, I am a lawyer. I've had the privilege of doing human rights work and working with lawyers from other countries. And I can say that the United States is rightly, in many respects, held up as a model for how the rule of law should be working, that we have the rule of law and not of men, and that folks who are even in public officials or rich folks are going to be held accountable for their actions. But that's not how we're acting here. We're acting in a secretive way. We're not complying with domestic and international law about even disclosing what we're doing. And we're certainly not complying with the law which suggests that we should not be firing missiles into civilian areas, killing civilians, and acting on our own in that respect. So I would conclude by saying this. We're in a situation now where the drone attacks have not led to a war crimes tribunal yet. We're in a situation now where there is no congressional movement, a significant congressional movement against drone warfare. There's not a lot of media and public outrage here in the United States against drone warfare. And so much so that a former U.S. intelligence official has been widely quoted as saying that drone attacks are quote-unquote politically foolproof. And they're politically foolproof because the American public only cares about how many of those bad guys that we're killing, especially when we're not putting immediately U.S. service members, men and women, into harm. So that's the question I'd like to leave you with tonight. Are drone attacks politically foolproof? Because if they're politically foolproof, there's no reason for us to ask President Obama and our congressional representatives to at least stop the use of drones outside war zones and non-military targets. At least comply with the United Nations and domestic requests to explain how targets are selected, the very minimum of domestic and international law. If it's politically foolproof, no point in asking the president for that. If it's politically foolproof, it's no point in us talking with other folks and other members in the international community about the need for a treaty to ban robotic warfare. We have treaties that ban chemical weapons. We have treaties that ban biological weapons, that that ban landmines. We have treaties that have addressed some of the more immoral and destructive and civilian killing forms of warfare, and it's time to consider that on the robotic warfare front as well. And finally, if drone attacks are politically foolproof, there's no point in us reaching out to Indiana drone makers. The companies and the institutions here, made up of good folks who are not intending every day they go to work to kill innocent civilians in Pakistan, but there's no point in us letting them know, well, can you recognize the story that Kathy Kelly told about the folks in Marancha, that these are human beings just like you and I are, and they're just as entitled to safety, just as entitled to a life as you and I are. And the stuff that we're making here in Indiana, the stuff we're testing, the stuff we're using here in Indiana, is stuff that's killing people in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan and Yemen. So can they recognize drone victims as human beings, and can they recognize the dangers of robotic warfare? So that's the question. Are drone attacks politically foolproof? Well, I think right now the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Drone attacks are politically foolproof. But the question is, how long is that going to sustain itself? Because it was once politically foolproof to be a dictator in Egypt, right? It was once politically foolproof to be to rule with impunity behind the Iron Curtain, or in South Africa. Here in the U.S., it was once politically foolproof to own slaves, to conduct wars in Vietnam or in Iraq without anyone criticizing it. But that changed. And that changed when the people of Indianapolis, the people of Fort Wayne, the people of Indiana, the people of the Midwest, the people of the country decided that drone warfare, that the actions involved were actually wrong. And so we will say here today that drone warfare is illegal, drone warfare is immoral, and drone warfare is self-defeating. If you'd like to learn more about how you can be involved in the action against drone warfare, check ipjn.org and find more information about how you can be involved in your own community. Thank you very much.